What's going on, family? This is Scrapbook Boxing Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. I want to take you on a quick ride. I'm going to do a quick video on a response of one of the brothers, one of my subscribers. He had texted me and he responded to a video that I did earlier today with Johnny Wilson, who was a middleweight champion of the world, and Harry Greb, who's also a middleweight champion of the world. And it was a two-part video. It was a second video on that Johnny Wilson video that I did. And what was interesting to him was the advertisement that he saw in the article. Now that page that he's referring to is in my scrapbook. It's a Harry Greb scrapbook, over 1,000 pages, 2,000 pages front and back. All Harry Greb information. And it was an article. So what I wanted to do was show you all the gymnasiums that a lot of these old-time fighters fought in. And I'm just going to go and show you a few of them, along with some of the fighters that fought, and I thought that would be interesting. And what I'm doing now is I'm showing you my 1923 record book. And it has a lot of the gymnasiums and other interesting things that you might find interesting to you. So Jersey's newest gymnasium, all right, it's called Jimmy Carter's. It was 500 Adams Street. It was in Hoboken, New Jersey. Now, I had mentioned to a lot of my subscribers, I've been around this game a long time. I was part of an organization, all historians, and I'm going back maybe 35 years ago. And we used to take field trips. And what we would do is pick up a lot of the old fighters in nursing homes, and we would take them to the areas and where they trained. We show them where they used to fight, all around the metropolitan area. And a lot of the fighters that we would take were about 80 years old, 75 years old at that time. And I'm talking 35 years ago. And the historians, a lot of them are gone now, but I learned a lot from them. They taught me so much about boxing because they were around when they saw, guys like Jack Dempsey's and Kid Norfolk's. They saw Sam Langford's, physically saw them hitting the bag. And they knew them, and they knew boxing. That's what they did all their lives. And so we would travel to the different gymnasiums. Now this one, Jimmy Carter's Gymnasium, like I said, is in Hoboken, New Jersey. And you had a lot of good fighters who trained there. And I'm going to show you a few of the fighters right now. Now, Sonny Smith. Sonny Smith was from Russia, but when he came over to New York, he would go over to Jimmy Carter's Gymnasium and train. Sonny Smith was a very good fighter. He fought fighters such as Young Gunn and Kid Berkey, Solly Green. Trying to remember some of these guys. Kid Marshall. These are some of the opponents he faced. Very good fighter was Sonny Smith. Another fighter that he knocked out, actually, was Charlie Goldman. Charlie Goldman was the trainer for Rocky Marciano. Solly Smith was a very, very good fighter, but I just wanted to show you him. He trained at Jimmy Carter's gym. Now you have here Danny Lee. Now Danny Lee, he also trained at Jimmy Carter's gym, but he also trained at Broadway Arena. Broadway Arena also had a gymnasium, but it was a place where you would have fights. He trained at Stillman's Gym as well. But Danny Lee was a very, very good fighter. He was a bantamweight. Fought fighters such as Kid Black. Now, you probably heard me mention Kid Black before. He was in there with a lot of great fighters as well. He was in there with George Daly and Eddie Mack and Johnny Larkin as well. And Danny Lee was a very good fighter, but I just wanted to show you Danny Lee, good Jewish fighter. Now, Sid Terrace, outstanding Jewish fighter. As an amateur, he won 50 consecutive fights, never lost. He won the Metropolitan Games, but he's most known for fighting a fighter by the name Ruby Goldstein. Now, Ruby Goldstein was a phenomenal fighter. He was a Jewish fighter from the Lower East Side. And he refereed some great fights. He was in there with Ray Robinson and Joey Maxim. As a matter of fact, he had to be replaced. I'm speaking of Ruby Goldstein. With Ray Miller. Ray Miller was from Chicago. He was a dynamite lightweight. He was knocking out everyone. But Sid Terrace was in that group of guys, as well as the Nebraskan Wildcat, Ace Hutkins. All of them was great fighters. But Sid Terrace was a great fighter. He trained also at Jimmy Carter's gym. But he was also in a lot of gymnasiums I'm going to show you right now. I'm getting to some other gymnasiums. Stillman Gym and others. Now, Sid Terrace also trained at George Brothers Gymnasium. As you can see here, it's 250 to 252nd West 42nd Street. All right, now that's down there. They had a neat exterior. They had Mickey Walker's. Mickey Walker's was a very popular bar. And when you went into Mickey Walker's, you had hundreds of fighting pose boxers. Everyone went in there just to see that. But all the fighters would be in there at any given time of the day. But George Brothers Gymnasium was a few, I would say, stores down from Mickey Walker's. It was on 42nd Street. You could find Sid Terrace there, Ruby Goldstein. I mean, you name it, they were all there. Very good gymnasium was George Brothers Gymnasium. I just wanted to show you the advertisement. Handball courts, private instructions, boxing, wrestling, jiu-jitsu, and physical culture. You could have all that at the gymnasium. But at that gym, you also had Tim ODowd. Now, Tim ODowd was another good fighter. A lot of people don't know who he is. He fought fighters such as Young Lynch. Now, Tim ODowd fought fighters such as, actually, he defeated Patty Ryan and young Jack Dempsey, a fighter by the name of Sid Ryan. I mean, he was in there with some pretty decent fighters. Baby Ass, as far as I'm concerned, he was not too bad of a fighter. Joey Cook, Charles Risen. I'm trying to remember these guys. Lou Silver. Who else was he in there with? Red McDonald. My mind's going blank right now, but these are some of the fighters I remember him fighting. Based on my research of Tim ODowd. But he was one of the fighters that trained in George Brothers Gymnasium. Guess it would be nice if I actually showed you Tim ODowd. That's Tim ODowd. Now, this is Henry Ford. He also trained at the gymnasium that I just showed you. And he was a bantamweight for fighters such as Joe Steen and Johnny Leslie, Willie O'Connell. Trying to remember, Artie O'Leary. These are all local guys that he was in there with. Now, I want you to remember this fighter here. His name is Eddie ODowd. I'm going to show you a gymnasium that I always talk about. He trained there. I just wanted to show you him first. And Eddie ODowd was a very, very good fighter. He was. He fought fighters such as Tony Doyle and Tommy Stevens, K.O. Spelly. These are all local fighters as well. Battling Lewis, if I can remember correctly. What I'm showing you is my private collection here of... I got millions and millions of fighters in these scrapbooks, but I'm just trying to show you, just to give you an idea of where they trained and, you know, give you a little idea of some of the fighters. Now, I don't know if you ever heard of Red Chapman. His name was Morris Chapman. And I mentioned him to you. He was in there with fighters such as Johnny Dundee and Benny Leonard and some of the other great fighters. But he also trained in a lot of the local gyms. And he was a dynamic fighter, he was. Fascinating fighter. He fought Johnny Morgan, who was an up-and-coming young man at that time. And Johnny Brown. A lot of these guys I've done research on. And Spencer Gardner. A lot of these guys that you obviously wouldn't have heard of because they don't mention them in any boxing books. But, you know, a lot of people, historians and guys who search, they know these guys. And Red Chapman was some fighter. I have his profile. I can tell you all about him, but that's not what this video is about today. Now, this is Rocky Griffo, another fighter. All of these guys were born around 1902, 1903, all around that age group. And he also trained in the local gyms. He was from New York. He was actually from the Lower East Side. He was Italian and... he had a pretty decent punch. He fought fighters such as Patsy Wallace, Pacquiao Gatti. I have good profiles on some of the fighters that I just mentioned. Victor Pace, I'm trying to remember at the top of my head. Bobby Russell, Pete Hayes. They call him Petey Hayes, who was from New York. I'll show you him one day. Petey Hayes was a character. He was a good fighter, though. Very, very good fighter. Jim Martin. Just a few names. Now, this fighter here, his name is Andy Chaney. Andrew Kowalski is his actual name. And I believe he was born around 1897 or so. He was Polish-American. And he was not a tall fighter. He stood 5 foot 2 inches. But he fought some decent guys, Battling Reddy and Pete Herman. Now, Pete Herman was from Louisiana. He wound up becoming a champion. Petey Herman. I learned so much about Pete Herman because I knew another historian who was from Louisiana, Baton Rouge area, and he told me a lot about Petey Herman. So I did my research on Petey Herman. Very good fighter. Harry Kit Brown, Charlie Bleacher, Johnny Murray. These are some of the names. Gene Delmont. You heard me say Gene Delmont a few times. He was also a very good fighter. Let me show you some more gymnasiums. One of my favorite fighters, outstanding fighter, was Benny Vogel. Excuse me, I don't know why I can't talk today. Benny Vogel was some fighter, outstanding Jewish fighter. So you had some great Jewish fighters. Outstanding. Now I had befriended a guy by the name of Teddy. He was Jewish. And he knew them all. Teddy was about 82 years of age when I knew him, about 35 years ago. And Teddy had books upon books of these guys. And he told me hours and hours and hours about these guys. So I know all of these guys. I know their records. And Benny Vogel was some fighter. He was dynamic. Remember, he fought a fighter by the name of Mike Russell. I think I mentioned him once before. Sammy Diamond. All of these are very good club fighters coming up. And you wouldn't hear of these names because they're not popular names. Ray Rivers and Phil Al and Frankie Wilson. A lot of dynamic fighters. They were very good at that time. And I think I mentioned before, you had a fighter by the name of Ray Miller. He was from Chicago. He came and fought a lot of Jewish fighters. But his biggest rival was Ruby Goldstein. And I think I mentioned that before. Ruby Goldstein was some fighter, very good fighter. And at that time, when you went into the neighborhoods, you were like a world champion in your neighborhood. You had all the support in your area. And you could probably fight a guy a block away from you, which was probably a division of that area. And he was considered the world champion. But he was, local stuff. But Ruby Goldstein, he was the top Jewish star outside of Benny Leonard at that time. And Benny Vogel wanted to be amongst them. And he was some fighter. And he trained at a lot of the gymnasiums that I mentioned to you, but I'm going to show you some more right now. But Benny Vogel was some fighter. I've done so much research on him, and I can tell you, dynamite fighter he was. And I'll keep telling you I'm going to show you some gymnasium. I just wanted to show you Kid Kaplan, Louis Kid Kaplan. He was some fighter. He was a junior lightweight. He was also a featherweight champion of New England. He was out of New England. And he was in there with very good fighters, Red McDonald and Freddie Jacobs, if I remember correctly, Dick Russell, Johnny Leasley. Just a few names I can think of at the top of my head. And once again, he was in there with Kid Sullivan and Gene Delmont. Gene Delmont is all over the place. K.O. Al Wagner. These are some of the opponents he was in there with. But I've done my research on him, and I can tell you, Louis Kid Kaplan was some fighter as well. And he trained all over these gymnasiums. Now let me quickly show you Eugene Creek. He was a champion, featherweight champion of the world. He was in there with guys like Benny Leonard and the Scotch Wop, Johnny Dundees, just to mention a few. But he trained at Jimmy Carter's gym in Hoboken, New Jersey when he came in town. He was from France, but he was a phenomenal fighter. And he fought fighters such as Pat McAllister, Kid Sullivan, Digger Evans. I mean, I'm just thinking at the top of my head right now. Sometimes my mind goes blank. But he was in there with some of the great fighters. But Eugene Creek, dynamite fighter. Very, very good fighter was Eugene Creek. But he was in there with Jack Britton and others. All right, so Philadelphia Jack OBrien, his headquarters was in Philadelphia, obviously. That's where he trained. But it was in a Wilson building. As you can see here, it's 15th and Chestnut. Now, I know what Chestnut is. That's basically North Philly. And we went there as well. The building is there. Obviously, the gymnasium is not. But Philadelphia Jack OBrien, he was a light heavyweight champion. He fought Tommy Burns and others. He was in there with Sam Langford. Sam Langford defeated him, but they made it a draw, I believe it was. And that belt wasn't on the line anyway. But Jack OBrien was a decent fighter. But that was his headquarters. It was on 15th and Chestnut Street. Now, Ridgewood Grove Sporting Club. This was a place, it was on Cypress Ave. This was a place where you would have some fights. A lot of the local fights were there. And it reminded me of some local fights like Broadway Arena, which was in Brooklyn. And you had Sunnyside Gardens. I mean, you had so many of these arenas. St. Nicholas Arena. St. Nicholas was on 66th Street, across from where Lincoln Center would be today. And you had some great fights out of St. Nicholas Arena. Well, Ridgewood Grove Sporting Club was like that as well. A lot of the fighters that I showed you all fought there. Now, another fighting club, you had Lenox Sporting Club. It was on 107th Street. It's between Lexington Avenue and Park Avenue. That's in Manhattan. A lot of great fights out of there as well. It's in New York, obviously. As you can see, the promoter is Phil Rosen. But you had some great fights at the Lenox Sporting Club as well. Perhaps one of the top two sporting clubs, which is Stillman's Gymnasium, that I'm going to show you today. I'm going to show you also Grubb's Gym. But Stillman's Gymnasium, it was 919 8th Avenue. It's close to 52nd or something street. Can't quite remember. But we went there as well. Obviously, the gym had closed down by the time we got there, but their building was still there. It's on the second floor. And you had some of the greatest fighters of all time. Now, Lou Stillman was the manager. He used to carry a 45 on his side. He had some of the greatest fighters in history trained at Stillman's Gym. Stillman's Gym was one of those gymnasiums that was close to Madison Square Garden. So all the fighters that came out of town were trained at Stillman's Gymnasium. And that was one of the best gymnasiums in boxing history. Now, you had Stillman's Gym, obviously Gleason's, was in the Bronx, New York, on 149th Street. And you also had Grubb's Gym, which is on 16th Street, and I'm going to show you Grubb's Gym now. Oh, excuse that buzz. That was an Amber Alert. But Grubb's Gymnasium, Athletic Club. This gymnasium was something else. As you can see here, I'll give you a better vision. It's the home of champions, 252 West 116th Street, New York. And this is where you had some of the greatest fighters in history. You had Kid Norfolk, Sugar Ray Robinson. I mean, you had Johnny Wilson. He was from New York, Johnny Wilson. He was from Harlem. He trained there. You had George Godfrey training there. Sandy Sadler trained there. Now, I'm showing you Johnny Wilson. He's the reason why I actually did this video. So I did a video on him today. But he trained there as well. He was from Harlem, New York. And he was in Grubb's Gym as well. He was a middleweight champion. And he defeated Mike ODowd and lost his title in 1923, the Great Harry Greb. Now, Kid Norfolk. I don't think there's any more research I can possibly done on Kid Norfolk that I haven't done. He trained at Grubb's Gym. He was a colored light heavyweight champion. He had good wars with Lee Anderson. And Kid Norfolk, one of the greatest light heavyweights of all times. No question about it. But he trained in Grubb's Gym as well. I'm going to show you one or two more. This is the Pioneer Athletic Club. It was on 24th Street on the east side of New York, or Manhattan, I should say. And you can see here Johnny Attell, who was the advisor matchmaker. He had a lot of good matchmakers during those days. And Johnny Attell was some matchmaker. Well, my battery's about to die. Let me try and squeeze in one more for you. This will be the last one. The Flower City Athletic Club was a convention hall in Rochester, New York. And Rochester is not too far from New Rochelle, Mount Vernon area. I'm sorry, actually Rochester. It's upstate New York. It's up there by